We'll call to order the Finance and Operations Committee of the Tennessee Higher Education Commission of this session today at August 14, 2024, about 1 p.m. I'm David Lillard, Tennessee State Treasurer and Chair of the committee. We have Commissioner Vernon Stafford here with me, and also Comptroller Jason Mumpower, I believe, is virtually joined. We may have others listening in as well. So we do have a quorum with the Comptroller's presence here today by virtue of that, his participation by phone. The first thing we're going to do is call the roll, and then we'll have adoption of the agenda and adoption of a statement of necessity. So, Madam Secretary, would you call the roll?
Commissioner Matlock, Commissioner Stafford,
Here.
Treasurer Lillard,
Okay. All right.
Comptroller Mumpower.
Here.
Chairman, you have 3 members present.
Okay, and we also have Commissioner Rader, who is with us today virtually as well. Welcome, and he's not a member of the committee, but his participation is certainly welcome. The next item would be, let's see, we have to adopt a statement of necessity, don't we, here? As I recall.
We do.
Yeah, we do. So, Madam Secretary, you want to read the statement of necessity for us?
Committee members, a quorum of members are participating electronically today. As such, Tennessee Code Annotated 844-108B2 requires that the committee make a determination that a necessity exists in order for a quorum of members to participate by electronic or other means of communication. A necessity means that the matters to be considered by a public body at a meeting require timely action by the body, that physical presence by a quorum of the members is not practical within the time period requiring action, and that participation by a quorum of the members by electronic or other means of communication is necessary. In this case, 2 facts support a determination of necessity. First, today's agenda items require timely action by this committee to meet the Commission's charge to develop a recommendation for the agenda items to be considered by the full Commission on August 15, 2024. Second, scheduling conflicts and other commitments prevented a quorum of members from being physically present today.
Okay, you've heard the reading of the statement of necessity. To get it on the floor, discuss the chair will move adoption of the statement of necessity. Is there a second?
Second.
All right, Commissioner Stafford seconds that. And I believe Commissioner Epps, I want to note to the record, is with us here virtually too as well today. Welcome for your participation. All right, is there any discussion on the statement of necessity? Seeing none, Madam Secretary, call the roll on the motion to adopt the statement.
Commissioner Stafford,
Aye.
Treasurer Lillard,
Aye.
Comptroller Mumpower.
Aye.
Chairman,
Okay.
you have 3 ayes.
All right, it's adopted then. Next item would be adoption of the agenda that we have before us here. I propose that, let's see, I guess we need one amendment to that to correct the regular calendar item to transmission of the 2024-25 proposed operating budgets. Are there any questions or discussion about the agenda? All right, seeing none, Chair would move approval of the agenda and adoption of that. Is there a second? We have a second by Commissioner Stafford. Seeing no further discussion, Madam Secretary, call the roll on the motion to adopt.
Commissioner Stafford,
Aye.
Treasurer Lillard,
Aye.
Comptroller Mumpower. Comptroller Mumpower.
Yes.
All right, see, it's adopted then. All right, the next item is approval of the minutes from the May 10, 2024 meeting that are in your packet. Are there any corrections, additions, changes to the minutes as proposed? All right, seeing none, is there a motion to adopt the minutes?
I was not present.
Okay, you were not present for that meeting. Okay, well, the chair will move adoption. of the
Motion.
minutes.
I'll second.
All right, the comptroller seconds it then. All right, very good. Seeing no further discussion, call the roll on the motion to adopt the minutes.
Commissioner Stafford,
Abstain.
Treasurer Lillard,
Aye.
Comptroller Mumpower.
Aye.
All right, item is adopted. Next item is on our regular calendar. Oh, excuse me, public comment. We've got to ask if there's any public comment to be that's been received for our meeting today.
No, Mr. Chair, no public comment today.
Okay, so the chair has asked about that, and we'll let the record reflect that there is none. Our next item is our regular calendar transmission of the 2024-25 proposed operating budgets. We'll call on Mr. Russell Van Zomeren, Senior Director of Fiscal Policy, to provide an overview of that item.
Thank you. Good afternoon, members of the committee. Russell Van Zimeren, Senior Director of Fiscal Policy. Glad to be with you here today. As a reminder, THEC is tasked annually in the appropriations bill to collect the budgets from our institution boards, the 6 LGIs and Tennessee Board of Regents, as well as the UT system, and transmit these operating budgets on to Finance and Administration with comment. Our role here is not approval of the budgets, but collection of the data in a systematic way, and then transmitting them on again to Finance and Administration, ensuring consistent and accurate information. I'll give a quick overview of some of the things that we've seen in the budget for this year. So for our formula units, we have $75.6 million in new recurring money. From the prior year, that's about a 4.8% increase. Much of that money is in formula and outcomes. There's about $15 million in insurance in there, as well as some money for TCAT Stanton operating dollars. At our specialized units, we have just shy of $21 million, an increase of 3.4%. Again, most of that money is going to be in salary and operating. A quick look at where our budgets are today relative to where they were last year, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and really just understanding the makeup of our institutional budgets. So up top there, you can see our community colleges. Down on the bottom, our universities. The larger gray dot that you see there is the data for this year. The other dots reflect prior years. And so looking at our community colleges, you can see that state appropriations make up a much larger share today than they did 5 or 10 years ago. Actually, a slightly smaller share this year than they did last year. That is matched by a decline in the share of revenue that comes from tuition and fees, so down under 40%, whereas in prior years, perhaps as high as 60%. We can see a similar story at our universities, though perhaps on a smaller scale. We do have state appropriations making up a larger share of the revenue at our universities, matched by that decline in tuition as a percent of overall revenue. For expenditures, we'll take these one at a time. We have our community colleges here first. A slight decline in expenditures on instructions over the last 5 or 10 years, matched by increases in operations and maintenance and student services. For our universities, again, a similar story, declines in expenditures on instructions, and let me be clear here, these declines are relative declines. There are real value increases in each of these categories, but as a share of overall expenditures, a decline. Increases in the share on research, as well as academic support and scholarships and fellowships. My last item for you here today is an update on the tuition and fees for 24-25. We had a pretty robust discussion with this committee and with the board back in May about the tuition and fee range. The values you see on your screen and in your materials are the combined percent increases for our institutions on undergraduate in-state maintenance and mandatory fees for the upcoming year. What we saw in the tuition increases from our institutions was a pretty wide variety of how they use that range, as low as 2.4% or as high as 5.2% increases in tuition and mandatory fees. In talking with our campuses about the need for this additional revenue, the number one category by far that we heard was on salary. And that could really mean one of 3 things. Some institutions using the additional revenue to meet the 3% salary file, some institutions trying to accommodate that FLSA increase that we discussed, going from I think $35,000 to $44,000 on July 1. That rule is already in place and our institutions have to be compliant with it. And then lastly, salary studies. Our institutions are competing for faculty, whatever it might be, on a national scale, and so they're trying to make sure that their salaries, their benefits are competitive in what's been a really tight market over the last couple of years. That concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Commissioner
Okay.
Stafford, yeah.
Questions? Yes, Commissioner.
Help me, Russell, on looking at.
Turn your mic on.
Sorry. Looking at the percentage of expenses allocated to teaching functions
Right.
has gone down quite a bit over the years. How should we be thinking about that? Why is less being allocated to teaching functions when that's the primary objective?
It's a great question, and to be honest, I think the answer might vary by sector. So we have those data here, which will give you a high-level overview. When we're thinking about our community colleges, we have seen more, especially in that operations and maintenance category. You can see that on the screen now. Really, that's an economy of scale function, is how I see it. And so, if we have, as we have in the last couple of years, maybe some declining populations at the community colleges, the sizes of the buildings haven't necessarily changed. You're still having to pay electrical cleaning fees on all these various spaces. And so naturally, as a percent of the overall budget, that category is going to expand. At our universities, it's really been investments in research. You can see we've gained a couple percentage points on research and that makeup as part of our budget, as well as scholarships and fellowships, which I actually think is a really heartening story. So it's not necessarily that our institutions aren't investing in students and teaching in the same way that they were before, but maybe investing differently.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir, Comptroller.
thank you. And Russell, if you back up, I think one slide, two slides, it is, or maybe three slides, wherever the chart is, it shows the percent by which tuition increased at the various institutions.
Yes, sir.
I do think it is notable with the hearty discussion, as you mentioned, we had at the last meeting about the range setting, that not even one institution maxed out the possible range. In fact, several came in well below it. And one thing that, of course, we talked a lot about the rule, the potential for that to be a burden on institutions. We talked about also cost-cutting measures, and I'll ask at some point in time, not right now, but for institutions to talk about what kind of cost-cutting measures they've instituted. But I just think it's notable for this committee to recognize that 5.5% was the ceiling, and not one institution did that.
So noted, Comptroller, I agree.
Yeah. Russell, while we're on that general subject here, in the memo, the staff memo on this, it points out that tuition and fee revenue is expected to grow by 8.1% for universities, community colleges, and TCATs in FY 24-25. How does that square up with, what we've got on the example here, for this situation and all? And as everybody's noted, we had a robust discussion about this previously. And so what are your thoughts about that 8.1% that you're projecting there?
That's right. I would say two things. First, so there is an opportunity for our institutions to grow their overall tuition revenue beyond what the range might suggest, because of course they could be increasing the number of undergraduate in-state students they're serving. They could be enrolling out-of-state undergraduate students for whom this body has no purview over their tuition and fee setting, or graduate students. I think all of those are opportunities for our institutions to maybe think about what their ranges might be, what that split is going to be between out-of-state revenue and in-state revenue. The other thing I'll add is these are very much proposed budgets, right? We know that our institutions are planning as if, they might have this amount of tuition revenue. We'll come back to this body in January with those revised operating budgets, and I think we'll have a more clear picture of whether that 8.1% held up.
Okay. All right. We'll talk a little bit more about this, and then we've got our further discussion later in the agenda about the model, the tuition setting models. We'll talk about that a little bit more at that point in time. Okay, any other questions of Russell in regard to this matter? All right, seeing no other questions, we'll proceed on with this then. We need to adopt a recommendation, I guess, to the full board to adopt the proposed operating budgets for 24-25. Is there a motion to that effect? I have a motion from Commissioner Stafford. Is there a second? I'll second the motion. So is there any further discussion on that point? Seeing none, Madam Secretary, call the roll on the motion to adopt.
Commissioner Stafford?
Aye.
Treasurer Lillard?
Aye.
Comptroller Mumpower?
Aye.
Okay, the item is adopted. Thank you, Russell. Appreciate your good work on that. Next item is the Austin Peay State University Master Plan. I think we have Shiraz Rush-Parver here to introduce our speaker on this today from the university. Good to see you, sir.
Thank you so much. Oh, it's kind of loud. Good afternoon, commissioners. Thank you so much for having me. I am pleased to present the Austin Peay State University 2024 Campus Plan. I'd like to introduce Art Litsky of Dobra Litsky Mate. Art has been working with APSU for the past year to guide the creation of our new master plan. He worked closely with the representatives from every department and division, including but not limited to academic affairs, finance and administration, physical plant, student affairs, and many others. All told, over 100 stakeholders contributed to the comprehensive plan representing our vision for APSU's future. This master plan represents an exciting opportunity. APSU has decided that the best course for the next 10 years is to improve existing square footage by renovating, repurposing, right-sizing classrooms, and redistributing space in existing square footage. However, our campus updates are intended to meet the needs of our students and anticipate enrollment growth through renovation and modernization. We believe this decision makes the best use of our resources. With that, I'd like to introduce Art, who will provide details and walk you through the master plan as approved by our Board of Trustees for your consideration. Thank you.
Mr. Litsky, welcome.
Pleased to be here. Thank you very much. So I've been working with Austin Peay. We did several earlier master plans with the university. So this is the third master plan that we've done with them. And it's actually, you know, even though it's the third master plan, there are different administrators, different faculty, different needs, and so on. Here's a list of some of the folks that we've met with over the last year to get a better understanding of the nature of the university, what they're trying to accomplish, where do they want to go with their facilities and so on. It was, I think, a very open and participatory process for us and for them. Part of the study is to look at the existing situation, look at the existing campus, looking at the existing buildings, and to understand their nature and what might be needed to make some improvements. So the drawing on the upper left-hand side of this slide shows what we call the predominant building use, and it's color-coded by use, and it's probably too far away from you to be able to see it and make sense of it, but the red buildings are the academic buildings, the yellow buildings, the tinier buildings, are the residential buildings, and they're actually divided west and east, east and west. And in the middle of that are, in the green, are the student life and student oriented types of buildings. So it's a really nicely organized campus. It's a pedestrian campus. It's easily to move around on and easily to find a place to park. On the upper right-hand side is the pedestrian walking distance and walking on campus. There's a red circle there that is based on the front door of the library. And so you can see there's an arrow that goes from the front door of the library to the edge of that circle. That's a 5-minute walking distance. So across that distance, across the circle, is 10 minutes. And you want all or most of your academic buildings to be within that circle because that's the time between classes. And in fact, they almost all are. In fact, you could just move the circle up a little bit further. They all are within that circle. The drawing on the lower left shows the vehicular circulation and the roads that are maintained by the city and the roads that are maintained by the university. And we think, and I think the university believes, that it's going to be important for the university to have more control over those city streets that are within their campus than they do today. And the drawing on the lower right shows the parking spaces on campus, and there are about 4,000, almost 5,000 parking spaces, slightly above the average of about 200 universities that we have information on. So that was just part of the analysis that we were doing. We also looked at utilization of classrooms and laboratories. So this chart, which probably you can't read from here, wherever you are sitting, shows the utilization of laboratory, instructional laboratory space and studio space from the fall of 2023. There were 87 of those types of spaces, and they were scheduled on average 16 hours per week. THEC recommends 20 hours per week. So there is room for growth in those numbers. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. We also looked at classroom utilization. There were 83 classrooms that were scheduled in the fall. They were scheduled on average 16 hours per week. 23 hours per week. I can't read it from here. 23 hours per week, and THEC recommends 30 hours per week. So again, there's room for growth in those numbers. The university has, after looking at these numbers, decided that they need to create a committee to review classroom utilization and laboratory and studio utilization on campus. And that committee is going to be working towards trying to think about better software to schedule classrooms and laboratories, and to see whether or not there are some rooms that can come offline to be reused for some other purposes. So part of the process was to come up with a understanding of the needs of the university. And in the analysis of the buildings and the analysis of the campus, we came up with a long list of individual projects that the university should consider. We asked them to prioritize that list because it was a long list and that it was something that the university could not create or cannot, could not go through within the 10 or 15 year time period. And so it went through this process, the administration went through the process and looked at the list and came down to this smaller list of prioritized projects, and they are listed here more or less in the order in which they were thinking about them. We also thought that we should try to highlight some key projects within that, and so here's a smaller list of projects that they feel are important to the advancement of the university. And they have immediate impact on attraction and retention of students and faculty, in fact. It improves student life resources, and it creates a really exciting campus. They're transformational. So I'm going to take you through the master plan as it was presented to their board of trustees. It's a plan that is based mostly on capturing their existing space and reusing it. There's just a small amount of new construction in part of this to move some things along that they couldn't do otherwise, but it's a capturing of existing space. So here's a little more detail of it. I'll just take you through one by one. This is the military academic building. It's their high priority. It brings together 5 programs that the university wants to nurture and to support in ways that they can't do it now. So this is a renovation project that is their highest priority, I believe. So this building is the health professions building. It's the sort of result of the previous master plan. It is currently under construction, and it becomes sort of the linchpin in moving the rest of the master plan forward. Sorry. It's going to vacate. I need my much better. So that building is going to vacate 3 different buildings on campus, or spaces in 3 different buildings, and they become important to the advancement of this. One of the buildings that will be vacated is in Dunn Center, when the humanities and when the health professions and human resources department moves into the new health professions building. They will vacate space. When they do that, then the space becomes available for something else. And that something else is moving ROTC from Memorial Health, which is the building that I just circled, into the Dunn Center to free up space for University College. University College is a new college created about 6 months or so ago, and it brings together student-oriented resources that are important to the university. And you can see them listed here. The library is an existing building. There is a new librarian in place. She has some great ideas for rethinking about the library. The libraries of most colleges and universities, or many colleges and universities, are moving away from storage of books to making the library more student-oriented. And that is something that she would like to obtain, and the university is supporting her in that idea. So Ellington Hall is a student-oriented building with student services. It is in dire need of renovation. And the question is, how is the best way to do that? And it either is going to be completely vacated to let it to be renovated, or it can be renovated in stages, either a wing of the building or a floor of the building. So it can be renovated over time. But it needs to move forward. Marks Hall is a building that currently has what does it have? It has what is it called? Middle College. Middle College, which is moving into the Burt School, freeing up space in that building. That building will become a staging area to allow Ellington Hall or some other renovations to occur. But at some point in the future, that building might be demolished to make room for some other academic needs. Harnett Hall is an academic building. It has a need to improve their classrooms that are in that building, and needs to be renovated. So Clement Hall has space vacated when the health professions building is constructed, and that will be renovated for criminal justice and the Department of Communications. That's a building that is created for freed up space when the health professions building is constructed, and this would occur on the second and third floor. McCord is another building that has space freed up on the second and third floor when the health professions building is constructed, and that will be used for psychological science and counseling, for their case program, which is for for faculty advancement and development, and a faculty lounge. Blount and Sevier Hall, they are two dormitories, student residences, male and female. It lacks really contemporary social space, and we think that that needs to be renovated. It will remain housing. So as we think about university housing, the university doesn't believe it needs, the university believes it has sufficient housing for the future. But at a point when the enrollment might shift and there is a need for future housing, there are two sites that we've identified that might be useful for student housing in the future. Part of our investigation of the overall campus looked at circulation on the campus and around the campus. And we think that there are some intersections that should be landscaped and enhanced that shows something about the fact that these are important intersections within and at the university campus, and needs to have some way to mark the fact that this is something to slow traffic down and to make it a much more safer circulation pattern. Those yellow stars are locations for student gathering spaces, outdoor student gathering spaces. They are important for the university, and we think that they need to be enhanced either through furniture, outdoor furniture, or landscaping, or both. And let's see. So I'm going to show you something here about how we think the campus might expand over, or not expand, but grow over time. So this red line here shows that we think that Henry Street, from the alley to I want to say Memorial Hall, but Marion Street should be closed. There's no reason for it to be open. It doesn't really help the university, and it can create a more pedestrian environment. This street, this is Jackson Alley, and it will remain to be open, but we think it can be strengthened as a pedestrian circulation path, principally because it also leads to the new University College in Memorial Hall. So it really needs some landscaping and some improvement to make it a safer walking and enjoyable walking experience for students. Marion Street is a street that the university does not control, although it should. It is a very fast-moving street, lots of cars moving back and forth more quickly than they should, more safely than they should. And we think the university needs to have and continue to have conversation with the city about, first of all, doing something about those intersections, but also potentially closing the street and gaining control over it. The university owns the land on all sides of that street, and there's no reason why it should remain in the city. The university has had discussion with the city about the potential for closing it, and I think those conversations are going on. This is a map that shows the potential land acquisition. The sort of darker salmon-colored land is land that we think the university over time should acquire. There is no need to be forceful or aggressive about it, but I think as land becomes available, the university should think about it, particularly along College Street, which is the horizontal street at the edge of the university, and particularly to provide more space for parking and for open space and landscaping and so on. Preliminary costs, project cost estimates. So these are costs that are for each of those projects that I identified. These are project costs, so they include construction cost, architects and engineers fees, furniture, equipment, contingency, and so on. And it's about 120 to 150 million total over that 10 or 15 year time period. And so that's their master plan. I'm sorry for my voice.
It's all right. Been a tough season for allergies and other things this year. All right, do we have any questions of the gentleman here in regard to the proposed master plan? All right, Commissioner Stafford, you're recognized.
All right, thank you for the presentation, and my questions may go to a couple of different individuals, but excuse me, on the memorandum page, we are provided the number of faculty and administrators, and I'm not sure how to look at that. Can you give that to me in ratio, and then is there a comparison on a benchmark basis to other universities or statewide or nationally?
So in the master plan we did, and I'm not showing it here, unfortunately, a comparison of this university to the 5 other universities in Tennessee. And we have shown that, is it in here? I don't think it's in here, is it? But THEC has a chart on a public document that is available for anyone to look at, and if you can get to it, It shows the amount of space per student for each of the different categories of space for those 6 universities. And it will give you a better sense of where Austin P is in comparison to that. And I don't have it here, I'm sorry, I don't have that. And I can't talk about the numbers, and I don't know whether or not Sharuz can talk about that.
And my question was really specifically toward faculty and administrators. Do we have more from a ratio perspective than we should, or are we pretty efficient? I'm not sure how that number compares to anything else.
The campus plan doesn't address that, but
Right. We don't have a comparison for this, but we can put something together and find something for you.
Yeah, it was provided to us, excuse me, in the memo that I guess the staff wrote. Now, I guess I'm not sure how to think about that number. It's just a number to me. I don't know what that says in terms of how well Austin P is maintaining expense control.
Well, as far as facility usage goes, there is a comparison per college on page 25 of our master plan that is Austin P compared to the other state universities in terms of square footage to full-time enrollment counts, and shares those ratios for different functionalities.
So here's what we can provide to you, Commissioner Stafford. We can get that page from the master plan and send it back out to this committee. We also do collect FTE of faculty, staff, administrators by campus as well, and we can run that up against FTE of enrollment as well. That's in our operating budgets that we collect. Russell, we get that information. We'll collect that and send it on to this committee as well.
Thank you. And then the second question I had was just with regard to funding of the projects. Obviously, it's a significant bill over 10 years. How much of that is expected to be raised versus what the school would hope to be funded through the state?
As we apply with the capital outlay plans, we will also be trying to raise funds to make those renovations. But at this time, we don't have a set percentage that we aim to raise for it. As each project comes up over the next decade, we will lay out a plan for each one.
Okay. And then I'll just comment that I like the fact that this plan is predominantly renovation and repurposing of buildings, particularly the repurposing of the library. I think that's a great idea. Are you seeing a significant reduction in the use of paper books? Excuse me. Or will this sort of force that effort?
well, I guess the way to think about it is, are the students taking out more books than they have in the past? No. Although they're using books, whether they're removing them from the library or not is another question. But I think that's happening nationwide now, where students are doing more things online, which is why the libraries I think are moving more towards that type of an environment.
Yeah, it just seems it's a great opportunity to kind of further push more toward the digital rather than the paper.
I still like books.
Yeah, I understand. You and I are the same age, so I agree.
Yeah.
We are in the process of already eliminating stacks in the library to move away from that. There's the special archives that will always be there and some specialty books, but we are moving more towards study spaces, and a lot of that is pushed by our new librarian who has great visions for what a library of 2030 should be, and that's the direction we'd like to move.
Okay. And then one last question. I noticed here in the presentation the comment that the university should be given permission to decide the best outcome with regard to properties. Is that permission being sought from THEC, or is that from the town? How does that work?
Yes, it would be THEC, State Building Commission, as we go through our process to reassess buildings that may need to be demolished, just because the cost of keeping them up or making them habitable it far exceeds their value. And so there are some buildings on campus that's 100 years old that have outlived their use.
So by approving the master plan, are we in fact approving their ability to go forward with destruction of properties?
The process that would involve from here, first of all, approving the master plan sets the stage for future recommendations and future approvals to this board and to the State Building Commission, General Assembly, and the administration. With regards to demolitions, I'm looking to Paul. Demolitions are typically included with outlay projects, like a new outlay project would be a demolition alongside of that. And that would come via this body here into the commission on a ranked prioritized list. We did start identifying a few years ago if campuses could demolish a building without having to renovate or construct something new. So a standalone demolition, what would that be? In the past, we presented that to this body for approval for recommendation going forward, or at the very least for information purposes to others down the road, down the line. But once the commission approves those ranked priorities, then it goes to the administration, to the General Assembly, and if those projects are approved for budgeting there, it then goes to the State Building Commission process.
Thank you. That's all.
All right, yeah, and to follow up on what Commissioner Stamper was asking about, of course, state law requires that, as Dr. Jindal pointed out, that demolitions of any state property, whether it's a higher education institution or a cabin in a state park, requires approval by the State Building Commission. So that's the final stop in that process, you know. But as Vernon's pointing out, it is a process. There's no doubt about it. And y'all would probably like relief from that process, I imagine, to some degree. So that's something to keep in mind. Any other questions of the presenter in regard to the plan? I had a couple of questions I want to ask. Vernon had raised some really good points on this, and that is in regard to the 5 projects that you're talking about renovating, and I, like him, commend you on renovation as opposed to new construction. You believe that's the most effective and efficient alternative. Are there any projections as to the cost of that, you know, that we adopt master plans all the time on THEC and everything, and other bodies do, and there's less than a complete quantification of what the future costs of that plan are. So I'm just wondering what kind of quantification is there of the costs of this plan in terms of the renovations that would be required, particularly on those 5 main buildings that you had there?
Well, let me go back a bit.
Okay.
So those costs are in 2024 dollars. So there is no inflation factor built into this.
Mm-hmm.
So it depends upon when these projects move forward,
Right.
the actual cost can be determined. So this is our best guess at this particular time, given what we know about those buildings.
Okay, all right. Well, I guess that's something that we'll need to take into account in our own capital planning process. You know, there's no doubt about that as we go forward and everything. Also, I wanted to ask on your master plan at the last slide here in our materials, you have a slide that shows future land acquisitions for the university. And yeah, the items that are in the sort of pink color there on it are the ones that you're looking at. Is there a detailed plan that shows what your priorities truly are about acquiring those properties? In other words, what are your 10 highest properties you're looking at, and what's the justification for that, et cetera, you know? What do y'all have on that these days?
So I have not spoken to the university about prioritization of any of that property. Although there probably is some understanding of which ones are more likely to be acquired than others. I don't know what those are. And I don't know whether.
Okay,
Vaguely, there's no immediate rush to purchase additional properties around the university. We would just appreciate the flexibility, so as the opportunity comes up, we have land for future development.
right,
As it is right now, the town has grown all around the university, so opportunities to grow on vacant land are next to none for us. So we need to be strategic in what the university may need for additional space in 20 years. And that's what we hope to do with this portion of the master plan. The urgent need land right now is a potential purchase of land and of a hangar and leasing of land at the airport. but that's the only one on the immediate horizon.
Right. Well, I recognize that, and on the State Building Commission, we also, have to approve any acquisitions of property by state institutions, including like land like this or something like that, And these are not like building major academic buildings in terms of the cost, but they're not insignificant either sometimes. And I would just urge that the TX staff look at and consider, and that the universities look and consider in the future having a more detailed process around what your priorities are about parcels that may come available. Many times on the Building Commission, we see acquisitions by a higher education institution, and the justification that's given for it is, well, it's on the master plan. It's part of our master plan, and it means it's part of a slide like this one right here that doesn't really have any quantification to it. And so it's sort of a belt and suspenders way of looking at, hey, this is available, and it's on our plan, so we ought to acquire it.
One of the problems, though, with prioritizing land acquisition is that this is a public forum, and the public can understand which properties are more important than others, and the price of those properties go up.
Right.
Right. So it takes away a negotiating strategy that the university might have, the more it prioritizes which pieces of land are more important.
Right. Well, that's all just part and parcel of the public world in which we all live, so.
Yep.
People can make a freedom of information request for the internal plans of the Tennessee Treasury Department if they want to do that, so it's all a matter of public record, but you're right to point that out. But I just point out that as we're entering an era where capital funds are going to be tighter, most likely much tighter than they have been over the last 8 to 9 years, I think there's going to be more need to prioritize and be strategic about how we look at future opportunities like this. So, whereas in the past, it's kind of like been on autopilot, I think, to some degree. When something comes available, we want to buy it. So I'll just point that out for consideration. Yes, Dr. Gentile.
I would also like to clarify some comments I made about the order of how prioritized lists go. That is for state funding purposes. If Austin Peay State University decided to acquire some of that land, or to demolish a building, or to build a building that's not using state funds, that would not go through our prioritization process. It would be disclosed to us and to the government, but the State Building Commission would be the first step of approval for any movement like that. And the State Building Commission includes the constitutional officers, the speakers, the governor, and the F&A commissioner. Am I missing anyone else? I think that's everyone. So that would be the formal check on Austin Peay moving forward with their own money to do that.
All right, any other questions of Mr. Litsky? All right, thank you very much. We appreciate your good presentation. All right, at this point, I want to consider the adoption of the University Master Plan of Austin Peay State University and its recommendation to the full TX Commission. I'll make that motion. Is there a second?
Second.
All right, there's a second by Commissioner Stafford. Seeing no further questions, Madam Secretary, call the roll on the motion to adopt.
Commissioner Stafford?
Aye.
Treasurer Lillard?
Aye.
Comptroller Mumpower?
Yes.
All right, items adopted. Next item is item number 3, 2025-26 operating state appropriation recommendations. Mr. Russell Van Zimmerman, Senior Director of Fiscal Policy, will present. Russell.
Good afternoon. Thank you.
Sorry if I might interlude again. I think we're having technical issues. Is that right, Heather, that the slides aren't advancing on the Teams? Is that correct?
They've got a camera pointed to the TV screen.
We have a camera pointed that we're making all ends meet here. Okay, thank you. If any commission members following along has more technical issues, please let us know. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, quick question. I am not able to stay the whole time. Have we passed the voting items on today's agenda?
I believe we have. Yeah, Scott Sloan confirms we have. So we're done with the voting items. Thank you, Comptroller, for being with us.
Very good. I have to be in another building. I will see you all tomorrow. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, Mr. Van Zimmerman, you're recognized.
Thank you. This is an informational item. As you know, we'll bring in November the official request for higher education for FY 25-26, but that doesn't mean that we haven't already started beginning to think about what that request might entail. And so I want to share a few things with you all today to give you a heads up of what you might expect to see in November, some of the things that we're thinking through right now as part of that process. And on our team, when we think about the budget request each year, we're really thinking about these three broad categories. First, for our formula units, first and foremost, the outcomes-based funding formula is going to drive a lot of what that request looks like. To some extent, we're also considering inflation and salary, and that really impacts what we think about when we look at our tuition model, which we'll talk about a bit more here again in a second. For our specialized units, those non-formula units, thinking about our colleges of medicine, our institutes of agriculture, and so on, their requests are largely, again, driven by inflation, salary, operating costs. And then lastly, there's this third bucket, these strategic initiatives. These really serve as an opportunity for us to assess the statewide needs, an opportunity for us to think about what we can be doing better, what are the things that we need to be working on, and how can we use our money strategically to address those concerns. We have our internal requests, which we'll hear from Amanda Clefane on tomorrow. Those are things that THEC is thinking through for FY26. Statewide requests, last year an example of this was cybersecurity. We're looking for something that really impacts all of our campuses and that we can use money to make a good deal of difference. And then lastly, our specialized unit requests. Our specialized units, as you see in the previous box, are really just looking at inflation and salary. They don't maybe have some of the same tools to expand their portfolios in the way that the formula units might, either through increased tuition or doing well within the funding formula. And so we might bring requests on behalf of those entities to expand their portfolios. Looking at the outcomes-based funding formula, we do not yet have new data, or I should say we have some enrollment data, but we don't have the main thing, which is going to be those awards data. We'll receive those at the agency sometime in September and have officially processed data in early October. But we do have prior year's data, right? And that actually tells us a good bit because of the 3-year average that we use. So when we look at the 3-year average to 3-year average, we already have 3 of those years. And we can see an example here, right? This is the enrollment or progression data for our locally governed institutions, and we can see some of those pandemic effects are continuing to play through the outcomes pipeline, right? If you look at point 1 there, that's the class that started in fall of 21-22 that was hitting those 30 progression hour metrics. Point 2 is when they would have been hitting 60 hours, and you can see the drop down in point 1. That translates over to a drop down in point 2, again a drop down there at point 3. And so we might expect maybe this continuing to deal with the pandemic effects when we get the awards file here later in September. The other thing to consider when we look at prior
Russell,
years.
Sorry, let's take a second here on this. I do like to point out that dark blue line is the first in that progression metric outcome, so the 30 credit hours.
Right.
That has had a spike up. And also, he did have a slide here showing the enrollment for 23-24. I said we just got that data. We need to vet that with the institutions. But if you can speak generally to what we're seeing as well, that's fine too. So thank you.
Great question. So generally for the enrollment, at least as it relates to the progression metrics, we have been trending in the right direction. That's true at our universities. That's true also at our community colleges, which you'll hear here in a second. We're excited about that. My larger concern, especially with our universities, is this backlog, right? These students that may have dipped down during the pandemic, those are turning into awards. When we think about our progression metrics in the formula, they might feel somewhat large, but in terms of actual outcome points that they're responsible for, we're only looking at about 10%, maybe 15% of the overall points. The formula is really driven by those award outcomes and some of the other research and service items that might be in there. This gives us a good look at what might be happening. Until we have awards, it's hard for us to know with any certainty. We'll take a quick look at some of the UT data that we have. And again, there's a similar trend with those pandemic effects continuing through the pipeline. You can see that at point 1, point 2. Interestingly, that's a slight dip down does not translate to 0.3 there, and we're working with our research team to better understand what's happening there. It may be that our UT institutions transfer in more students who wouldn't have been in the prior pipelines coming from out-of-state community colleges, what it may be. It may be an efficiency thing. We're hoping that when we come back in November, we'll have more to share there. And then again, 0.4, that'll be the data that we come to you with when we're back here in November. We talk about the 3-year to 3-year averages for our UT institutions. That may matter a good bit more this year. When you think about this, especially at the bachelor's level, that 2021 comparison point is a good bit higher than in prior years, which means to have that comparative growth in the outcomes-based funding formula, we'll have to see some pretty good numbers when we get that data in September, October. Let's talk about our community colleges, and really at the community college level, what we see is that the half-life of a pandemic is much shorter, right? And that makes sense. Some of these programs are much shorter as well. We see those pretty significant dips between 2018-19, 19-20, down into 2021, and then a stabilization and even some growth. I think when we run the numbers later this month or into next month, we'll see a more positive story at our community colleges than we have in the past couple years. I always talk to you guys about inflation. Here's our inflation slide. Looking at inflation for the most recent year, actually we just got these inflation data in this morning. We're at 3.2% for core CPI. This drives a good amount of our request, especially as it relates to the tuition model, which we'll talk about here soon. 3.2% is a good bit better than it's been in a few years, but still much higher than we would have expected in the decades prior to the pandemic. So we're headed in the right direction, but we're still not to where we want to be on some of these things. I mentioned how this might impact our request for this year. When we think about our tuition model, we have our state appropriations there for FY25 in the left bubble, as well as the tuition revenue combined. That's $3.4 billion. If we look at that core CPI of 3.2%, we might expect that in total our institutions would need just shy of $110 million to remain revenue neutral, accounting for some FTE and other metrics. That will be split out between appropriations and tuition. These data we don't yet know. If our state appropriations for salary were to come in between 2 and 3%, which is pretty standard for this state, that may account for some, my eyes aren't as good as they used to be, but someone has it on the screen, $28 to $42 million in salary revenue, which means the remaining balance of that would be either made up through outcomes funding or tuition revenue or maybe cost-cutting measures as well. I talked a bit about our formula units, so I'll touch briefly on our specialized units and some of the work that we're doing there and our strategic initiatives as well. Again, thinking through our specialized units, those requests are largely going to be driven by inflation and salary. That 2 to 3% salary estimate at our specialized units would be between 11 and $16 million. We're accounting for operating costs. Something we brought to you all last year that we're really proud of is continuing improvement on all of our specialized unit formulas. These are not outcome formulas in the ways that we think about our main funding model, but they do drive our requests to this body each year, and we're working to streamline those requests with our institutions and our partners at F&A. Finally, our strategic initiatives, I mentioned those offhand, but we're working again with our CFOs, presidents, thinking through what the needs of the state are as we get to FY26. And of course, we're open to the thoughts of this board about what they might like to see in a budget request when we come back in November. I'll pause there if there are any questions.
Right, any questions of Russell?
Russell,
On ahead, Commissioner.
I'm sorry. Russell, similar to conversation earlier regarding the budgets, recognizing that we've had some pretty good years in terms of state budget over the past decade, but that has sort of this past year at least thinned out a bit, and we don't know what the future will hold given inflation and the cost of interest expense and so on. But I noticed in the report that you provided earlier, clearly we've been helping the public universities significantly by the state paying more of their expenses rather than tuition going up as much as they probably would like to. How do we look at that going forward? Is the state going to be able to maintain that same rate of contribution for our public universities and colleges, or is there a different paradigm that's likely to come about?
This is the question. I think a lot of times when we look at our data, especially in the last 10, 15 years, the number of folks like to throw out is looking at what happened before 2008. Where do we compare? And in some ways, pre-2008 is maybe the goal that we're trying to get back to. The reality is for our community colleges, we're actually basically back to those pre-2008 levels. And for some of our institutions, our universities, we may be as well. I think the question for this body, the THEC staff, the higher education enterprise as a whole is like, is pre-2008 the right level? Is this the funding split that we would expect to see, where our universities are getting maybe 35 cents on the dollar through state appropriations, maybe 40 cents at some institutions, our community colleges, 60, in some cases 70% through state appropriations, or is there a different funding mix that we would expect to see? Of course, we only control half of this as well. Some of our institutions, some of our universities have done really well in appropriations, but also done well in tuition, and that keeps the mix, ever changing.
Thank you.
If I can add to that, sir. Mr. Chair. I think every time around this year, we start to hear from different entities at the state level that looks like it's going to be tight this year. And that's every year, as in like a preparation mode. We're hearing that more and more, and we know the good times that we've had the last few years when it comes to funding may be coming to an end, which reiterates the point, and the treasurer and I were having this conversation before the meeting. The purpose of a THEC, we are at most value when we help provide the recommendation protocol for the scarce resources that the state might have. What are the top 2, 3 needs of the state for higher education? That's why the outcomes funding formula was presented 15 years ago as our go-to mechanism. And so what Russell's been working on this summer with his colleagues at the institutions is how better to refine our recommendation mechanisms, and this is true with capital as well, to prepare for lean times when the state has to make those tough choices.
Thank you.
Any other questions of Russell? Discussion on this point? Thank you for that good presentation. All right, the next item is item number 6 or 4, on the agenda here. 4 is decision or division of post-secondary authorization fee schedule revision, and Ms. Julie Woodruff, Senior Compliance Counsel, and Dr. Stephanie Bellard-Chase, Senior Director of Post-Secondary State Authorization, will provide overviews.
Hello,
Thank
good
you.
afternoon. I'm going to talk with you just briefly about the rulemaking process that precedes the rule revisions that would change our fees. Dr. Bellard-Chase will follow up with more detail about what those rule fee changes will account for. So just in general, in order to change our fees, which are now codified by rule, we do have to engage in a rulemaking hearing proceeding. This process begins with filing notice with the Secretary of State for the rulemaking hearing. And at that time, we do propose suggested rules. That filing then stays at the Secretary of State's office for about 52 days. And after that, we have our rulemaking hearing, where we will have provided notice to all of our authorized institutions and any other interested persons we identify of the hearing, and they will have an opportunity to provide public comment with regard to the rulemaking. Following that, we would make a proposal. We would consider all of those comments, possibly even offer an opportunity for written comments to be filed, although we're not required to do that. And then we would consider those comments and then bring forward to the full commission the proposed rule that we plan to file with the Secretary of State. In any event, it is most likely that these rules will not be effective until July 1, 2025. So that's the timeline we're looking at. It is possible that these could come before the commission in November. It's most likely that it would be in January for consideration of the final rules. So I'm happy to answer any questions you have about that process.
If I can intrude in here for a second, Mr. Chair.
Sure.
The background of this presentation, and I meant to lead off with it, I apologize, Julie, on that. The Division of Post-Secondary Authorization, they're the ones who you'll typically see on our agenda for the consent items on the proprietary institutions or non-exempt, nonprofit and public institutions that are not Tennessee public institutions to authorize to operate here in Tennessee. Dr. Julie Woodruff oversees that for the SARA institutions, those programs that are online, the process there. Dr. Stephanie Bellard Chase will do that for the on-the-ground campuses. All of those institutions pay fees into the system. And about 8 years ago, there was is that correct, 2016? This is 2024? That's 8 years.
2016,
Okay,
yes.
great. My math is on top of it. About 8 years ago, there was a change in the structure of those fees. And it was known at the time that we as an organization would work against a reserve and whittle down that reserve. And eventually, the fees would need to be increased. When I became executive director, one of the first things that was put in front of me was that need coming soon and needing to address it. That also coincided with the fact that we have committees now. And I wanted to be able to, for lack of a better word, socialize the idea of what this is, what the issue is, what we're up against. And so it may not be November, like Julie said, but it might be in January when we come back to this body to start the process on increasing the fees via rule. It will be a substantial change, and also coinciding this morning's committee meeting with the Academic Access and Success Committee, we heard more about the great work that Dr. Stephanie Bellard Chase does, what they do, what it means to authorize, and we've been requested to have a smaller presentation on that tomorrow, just so you are more well aware of what's happening. So Julie just walked through what the next 6 months might look like to initiate a rule change and fee increase.
Thank you.
Julie.
Any questions? Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Dr. Bellard Chase. All right.
Thank you, Julie.
You're welcome.
Dr. Stephanie Bellard Chase, you're recognized.
Thank you, Treasurer Lillard. Excuse me. Dr. Gentile basically said what I was going to say. We are working in a deficit. We have been hitting our reserve since 2016. It's down to approximately $500,000 now. And so the deficit that we're working in is between $450,000 and $500,000 a year. And so the statute, which is 49-7-2014, does say that the commission is authorized to set fees annually based on the intent to collect revenues sufficient to fully fund all costs of this regulatory function. So we've been working on projections. We know what our deficit is, and we're looking at the renewal fees to make up that deficit, maybe all at one time or maybe in a two-step tier where we have one effective July 1st, 2025, and the next increase July 1st, 2027.
Dr. Bellard Chase, is there anything that poses a hurdle to putting a new fee structure in place?
The only thing I can see is schools not wanting to pay more. Yes, sir. But the last time we had a fee change, they were decreased, so.
Thank you.
All right, any other questions? All right, seeing none, thank you for that good presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, to both of you. All right, that concludes that item, and we'll move to item number 5, the THEC Fiscal Policy Reporting Update. Mr. Russell Van Zonderman, Senior Director of Fiscal Policy, you're on again.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. I'm here today with updates on 2 reports that my staff have been working on. I'll move through these relatively quickly and then, of course, pause, ask questions as you have them. I'll start first with the Higher Education Finance in Tennessee report. This report was really born out of conversations with this body, with our CFOs, and with the state and national counterparts that we interact with in the world of higher ed finance. And I do want to give a quick thank you to Stone Watson, who's sitting behind me here. He's been instrumental in helping this vision come to life as we work through this report together. The goal is to answer the sort of questions that our team is fielding every day, the sorts of questions, honestly, that we've gotten during our brief time together today. thinking through how do our institutions compare to each other, how do they compare to private or national or private or public national counterparts, what does student cost, student debt look like, all of these various things wrapped into one centralized location so that we can wrap our heads around this whole higher education finance enterprise. I'll give you 3 examples of things that we're looking to include in the reports. This is the same data, although a bit more outdated than what we discussed during the operating budgets discussion a few moments ago, and really just bringing those data to life, helping us better understand what we're seeing from our institutions. Really, we want to answer old questions and hopefully foment some new ones so that we can be really strategic about our higher education finance. Another example, tuition and fees by sector. This actually represents the data for this year. These are the same sort of data that you have in your materials, but as I mentioned before, brought to life a bit. We can understand, looking at this chart, maybe what a full 5.5% increase might have looked like at the UT system, at our LGIs, our community colleges, or TCATs. What's the makeup between their mandatory fees and their maintenance revenue? All sorts of different things that we're hoping to include and really illustrate the state of higher education finance, the state that our students are facing in terms of costs. This is actually my favorite graphic that we have in the report, and it's student share of tuition, or student share of the overall costs. What we see in this graphic is if you were to take the overall enterprise for higher education for that state, in this case we're looking at our 2-year institutions, and drop out state appropriations and scholarship. How much of that is left to the student to cover? In our state, that number is 2%. So essentially 2 cents out of every dollar is left to our TBR students to actually pay. That's number 1 in the nation. Because of our robust state appropriations and our scholarship programs, the students are paying very little out of pocket, at least with regards to tuition and fees. There are a whole host of other costs, of course, that we consider as well. That puts us number 1 in the nation by a pretty good mark here. It's work I'm very excited about. The other report I want to update you on is our strategic financial plan. This is a document that is statutorily required, and it encourages us to think ahead. What does the Tennessee higher education enterprise of 5 or 10 years from now look like? Really, we're looking at institutional costs, what is capital maintenance and outlay, what does the state appropriation look like? Commissioner Stafford, very much in the heart of the question that you asked earlier about sort of what is the right mix of all these funds going to our higher education enterprises. We've worked with about 25 THEC staff on this document over the last year. It's been a really enjoyable process. We have a lot of great staff here with a lot of expertise on higher education. Some of it finance, some of it otherwise, but all of it really germane to this report. And so it's something that we're excited to bring to you all, probably early in 2025. I'll give a few examples. Our state goal that we're thinking about for this is really to provide a high quality, affordable education, right? Knowing that it's not just about affordability, but also that quality piece. Knowing that our students need to leave with skills and knowledge that are conferred maybe through their degrees, diplomas, whatever it might be, but that are relevant and that help them succeed in the workforce. And then lastly, and this part really speaks to my heart, is the strong, vibrant communities. When I think about our institutions and the places they are across all of Tennessee, they're really pillars of their communities. And I think about that true when we think about funding our institutions. We're not just funding buildings or students or staff, we're also funding communities. We have 4 large groups that we think about in this report: tuition and fees, scholarships, state funding, basic needs, and other instructional costs. That last group there, getting at some of those costs I mentioned, the state does a really good job helping out students with some of the tuition and fees via scholarship. I think a space that we still have work to do is on basic needs and other instructional costs. That's not unique to Tennessee, but it is a reality for all of higher education. The report is categorized into, or our policies are categorized into 3 main buckets here. Foundations, these are things that we're generally already doing and ought to continue doing. Advancements, and these are what you might reference as small wins, things that we could pull off in a year or 2, small improvements that might have big impacts. And then those innovations, things that could take us a while to get to, but are nevertheless worth pursuing. I have some examples here on the slide. I don't have to talk through each of them, but I'll pause to take questions on either of these 2 reports or suggestions for inclusion.
Apologies. Russell, just a question of curiosity. On the scholarships, I know the students obviously get scholarships through the college or university. They get them through the state. But some students get them outside of the college or university through other private offers. Do we track those as well in terms of total contribution to the students' overall cost?
Great question. So for something like Pell data, yes. For something like an institution-specific scholarship, I don't know that we track that at the student level. Or if it was a community scholarship, same story. We wouldn't be able to track it at the student level.
Okay, that's what I thought. Okay, thanks.
Okay, any other questions or thoughts about this matter?
I just want to say, Mr. Treasurer, the first report, that's something that we've not put together and before and are working on, is also intending to capture a question that you've asked long ago that sparked us to start collecting the data and what the federal data has about to show, which is the institutional health of institutions, financial health for public and private institutions, to be able to capture that at a sector level, but internally to be tracking that more formally so that we can anticipate in the future what institutions will be in poor financial health, be they
Okay.
public or private.
Very good. All right, seeing none, then we'll go to the next item here, item number 6, tuition model and rates update. Mr. Van Zimmerman.
Thank you. Just a brief update on our tuition model. This is really just a reminder of how our model works and an opportunity to discuss, areas of improvement or things we ought to be considering as we get ready to set the guiding tuition range in November of this year. You saw a similar bubble chart when I presented earlier. This is actually the one we presented in November of last year, and it helps us understand generally what's happening in the tuition model. So we're taking state appropriations and tuition revenue, combining that, looking at core CPI, what that inflationary growth might be, and then how it splits out between state appropriations and tuition revenue. Last year, we estimated we would need about $83 million in additional tuition revenue. That $83 million, I think, equates to about a 5% increase. The actual range we presented in November was 0 to 6, and the reason that happens is because we're actually doing this for all of our institutions. So if we could aggregate all of the money for all of our institutions in one pot, the answer might be a 0 to 5% range. The reality is, for some institutions, maybe that would be a 0 to 4% range. For some institutions, 0 to 6, 0 to 7, whatever it might be. Here's another example of how this works. So if we have an institution with revenue of $17,000 per FTE, say $7,000 of it comes from state appropriations, $10,000 from tuition and fees, what we'll do is look at, okay, if state appropriations in this case was 4.4%, that's another $308. There's a remaining $442 that's still needed for this institution. That money we would expect to come from tuition and fees. Interestingly, for this model, since we are always comparing to last year's data, we're really just trying to adjust for inflation between the prior year and this year. We're not necessarily making any judgment about whether the prior year was the appropriate level of funding, whether it was too low, too high, but are you able to maintain your revenue per FTE, accounting for inflation? As I mentioned, we do this for all institutions. We also incorporate discount rates. You mentioned institutional scholarships. Some of our institutions have reasonably high discount rates, which means, while they may have a sticker price that's a good bit higher, they're only making 70 cents on the dollar for that sticker price. And so we account for that in the model. We also create ranges based on those appropriation levels. So the more we receive in appropriations, we incorporate that into the model. We expect the range will be lower. Some of the considerations we're making outside of the model. So of course, for our students, we're sensitive to student perceptions. This has been a major topic, especially in the last couple of years. How do students feel about higher education? How does that relate to what you can charge in tuition, price sensitivity for our institutions, balancing the budget, competing for students, fulfilling their mission? And finally, some of those state considerations, affordability being the top one, and then state appropriations, peer trends. What are other states doing? How are they handling this power? I'll pause there for questions or comments on the tuition model.
As you and I discussed, Russell, but I want to make sure that we, as we approach doing this process again this year, that we look at particularly, some of the circumstances we had last year as we mentioned here today, like the issue that came up with what our model reveals in terms of what a target percentage tuition increase would be, and whether that's at variance with what the commission's likely to recommend and to ultimately act on. And then also we had the last minute consideration last year of the Fair Labor Standards Act issues with potential overtime pay revisions. And I just want to make sure that we are trying to anticipate anything that might be a last minute input into the process and everything, and try to factor that in so that we don't end up having to revisit in the future what we've already dealt with previously. So those are some of my concerns. I mean, Commissioner Stafford, you may have other thoughts about those things, but okay. All right. Any other questions or any thoughts, Dr. Gentile? Do you have anything?
I just have a question for the committee, in that this tuition model that's in front of us is it was created for the commission, I believe, back in 2007, 2008, with NCHIMS, an outside organization. And as Mr. Van Zalmeren has shown, it was intended to capture where were the institutions last year, where can they go next year, but with no actual input from the campuses themselves or what their needs are. But this was back from when we had a guiding tuition range authority, not a binding range authority, which is new since 2017. What I just heard just now is that we work to look forward to what outside impacts might have on tuition outside of inflation, much like what we saw with the federal rule changes this past year. Is there a desire from the committee to have us get more, I'd say, idiosyncratic data or information from institutions on what their needs are specifically, or would you prefer it to be kept at a sector level, or what's impacting all institutions?
Well, I'll just comment for myself. I think more information that you can receive is probably helpful in the overall evaluation process. So I would say that, if there is information that is relevant that can be obtained about a particular institution's situation, that, as Russell will point out to you in conversation, that this is really the average of the averages is what we're dealing with here, and to the greater degree that we can refine the process, I think that gives it more authority, and that we are approaching it on a more reasoned basis than what we've done in the past. So let's look at that. I think that's something to consider, what you pointed out. Commissioner Stafford, do you have anything?
No, I agree. I think clearly the institutional information is important, but any additional information that gives greater insight, I think, is helpful.
All right. And I think, like we said, we want to make sure that we're trying to anticipate inputs that may occur throughout the whole process prior to the time that it becomes final, so that we're not looking at a situation where we're using binding authority that has been revised at the last minute, and things like that. Okay? All right. Thank you for that, Russell. We appreciate your good presentations today. Last item on our agenda is item 7, capital outlay process update from Dr. Gentile.
All right, thank you, members of the committee. I just want to provide an update on what has taken place over the last 7 months with regards to, actually 9 months, to updating our capital outlay process. And I'm going to thank Mr. Jason Cavender behind me, Ms. Amanda Clefane, Paul Marshall, Patty Miller, the whole team of facilities have helped out along the way, and fiscal policy as well, to getting us to this process right here in front of you. As you may recall, this has been a subject of lots of conversation with our institutions and with the administration and General Assembly on the value of the capital outlay process. I should also thank Brenda, who's sitting behind me. He's been a part of this process too, to get us to where we are right now. Lots of conversation about, does it meet the need? The process of prioritizing capital outlay, I mentioned earlier, the biggest reason to have something like this is when we have scarcity of resources. What are the top 3 projects to fund? The last few years, we've had not a scarcity of resources, where sometimes we're funding upwards of $1 billion a year in capital facilities, 20 projects in 1 year, 2 years ago, TCATs, a lot of those a couple of years ago. And our process was perhaps not as flexible to reflect the need of it. Further, we are statutorily required to prioritize capital outlay projects. There's been lots of conversation in the last 8 months. Should we move more towards a vetting of capital outlay needs and let the government, General Assembly, and the governor administration do as they are right to do, which is to not follow a list at all? But as we see it, we saw in front of us the task of addressing, working out a better way to prioritize the capital projects. We started this process back in December, where we convened stakeholders from the state and from institutions in a capital outlay task force to understand what their needs were, what they were identifying as opportunities. We reconvened them in February to hammer out further details and paint a picture of where we thought this could go. And then between March and June, talked with various stakeholders at the institutions, institution presidents, talked with constitutional officers and others to hammer out the finer details before, in July, releasing the final capital outlay process. Here's what we heard. What we heard was the process that we had since Focus from 2017 forward was too complex and it lacks transparency. The complexity was about what it took to fill out that proposal, how many fields they had to fill out. It was very much an RFP process where institutions had to fill out the proposals. And also, we had scorers who read it, and we didn't know what the individual scores were. We kept those behind closed doors and did not identify where the readers fell on their scores. But we also, however, did make transparent what the comments were. However, it seemed a little too behind closed doors what was happening in this process. Two, the process did not address individual facility needs well enough, nor did it address state needs holistically for academic purposes. Three, we did have a limit on how many projects an institution could submit or a system could submit. LGI is submitting 1 project, systems capped at 3, UT and TBR. That did not appear to be equitable given the different sizes of those institutions and systems. And also, like I said, the state was giving out more and more funding for capital outlay projects. There were many who felt that the state was not hearing all the true needs. And then 4, the need for more predictability. Because we had individual readers reading this from 1 year to the next, the scores would change from 1 year to the next, and so would the rankings. 1 year, ETSU's project might be ranked number 3. If it didn't get funded, the next year it might be number 7. Because they need to raise institutional match funds, Dr. Nolan would often say, I can't secure donation funding next year if there's no security here and predictability. So the process we have right now addresses, I'd say, 85-90% of what we heard. There's an asterisk up against number 2, and I'll talk through what it does not address, but we have a plan to be able to address it going forward. So number 1, the process is too complex, lacks transparency. We have simplified in our new process exactly what we're asking and what we're scoring. We are scoring subjectively the impact on state goals and the impact on the economic and workforce development. We are pass-failing items that Department of Finance and Administration requires, but are more, just want to make sure that this project is in the master plan. You'll need to give a description to what extent it is in the master plan, and we will score you on that. It's more pass-fail. We'll provide more upward information on the front end to all stakeholders on what the projects are doing, and we will work to coordinate opportunities for stakeholders at the state level to travel to campuses to better understand what's happening in those buildings and what is needed. You can see up here how many fields we had to begin with. for people to fill out, institutions to fill out, and we have greatly truncated, going from about over 30 to 20 different fields to fill out, and most of them have been whittled down to just a handful above that bar to be actually scored by individuals, everything else being pass-fail. So we wanted to take the onus off of institutions for having to prepare as if everything is going to be scored here and to streamline it down. 2, we heard that we need to have more recognition of facility needs on the campuses. What are the conditions of the facilities? We don't exactly have that information at the state level. It'd be good to incorporate that into our process. We still don't have that data to actually measure the true facility condition scores of all buildings on campus. That is a place we want to get to. We do collect consistent scores from the Tennessee Board of Regents, and we have that in our system of all buildings that fall under TBR. We don't have that for the University of Tennessee. We've talked to the University of Tennessee. They are willing and able to participate in such an assessment, but to do so would require an investment from the state that you'll hear tomorrow during our strategic initiatives conversation. What would it take to properly assess all buildings on all campuses so that we can then present here to other stakeholders, look, this chemistry building on this campus, you can see how in dire condition it is. And that's why it's prioritized heavily for us. 2, this was Secretary Hargett's input early on. He'd really like for THEC to be in a better position to say, oh, in this part of the state, we should probably have more nurses and therefore more facilities dedicated to nursing, as an example. So we have invested in a product that will allow us to better predict the workforce needs across the state. And this joins up well with what we heard through the academic program review process that we addressed earlier in the year, where we had provosts at campuses saying they'd like for THEC to help share with them knowledge on what the workforce needs across the state. So investing in that product, Jobs EQ, can be beneficial to both capital and to academic planning. 3, campuses must be able to submit more projects than they do. Again, before we had a governor on how many projects a campus can submit. We now have a process where every institution and system can submit as many projects as they would like to. Of course, the biggest check on capacity to do so would be on their ability to submit the proposals. But we did move to an unlimited number of projects. However, we did recognize that if a system or an institution submits to us an unlimited amount of projects, we don't want to get lost in our scoring system which projects are most important to them. So we are asking institutions to provide to us a weighted order that they submit to us that then will influence a small portion of their scores. And then 4, this is probably the most divided that we had on the capital task force, the need for predictability from one year to the next. What I'm ranked at this year should be a little bit more predictable so I know next year where I would land. We moved to a place of having a score, a new list every year with focus because at the time, TBR, who oversaw the LGI's capital facilities at that time, held a rather rigid list. And you got on that list and moved up as projects were funded over time. This was through the Great Recession going into 2015, 2016, where all the institutions were saying, that's not the system we want. We want to be able to reflect the true needs of capital on a more yearly basis. So we went 180 and scored anew every single year. So the ranked order would change every single year. There was some appetite to maybe just lock in place the top 5 projects from last year and have those be the top 5 projects this year. So if 1 through 6 was funded last year, 7 through 11 would be the top 5 next year to give some predictability. Everything after that would be rescored and re-ranked. There were some stakeholders who didn't want even the top 5 to be locked. They liked how things would switch from one year to the next. There were others who wanted more predictability, the top 10 to be locked. One president told us, look at the average amount of funding per year, see where that lands, and maybe have that be the locked top institutions. We did that analysis over the last 20 years, and we feel like the top 5 projects locked in as they are does give a little bit more stability, but not completely solid where we can't immediately return and respect the needs of the moment at our institutions. So this is where we've landed right now with the Capital Task Force. I will say this in any audience that I have, that the process is only as good as it reflects the needs of the state. We went some time without immediately addressing what I'd say what presidents of institutions and what stakeholders of the state have been saying for a few years about how the process isn't working. Right now, we are committing to coming back to a capital task force every year. Maybe it's a one-time meeting after everything settles down to identify how can this be improved and not waiting another 5 years or 6 years. This needs to be flexible and amenable to the changes that are happening at the state level. But this in a nutshell captures where we are right now.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Gentile, for that good work on behalf of you and the staff and everyone who's been involved in the process. And let's just say it continues to be a work of art and process here at this point, and but progress is being made, it sounds like. So, Mr. Stafford, do you have any thoughts?
No, I do agree that this is a big change, obviously. Is there anything that is pending that I guess is a burning concern among the presidents?
I think some concerns center on there is an enrollment aspect that influences how much weight you could put on different projects. It's a small sliver of the overall scoring, which that's done intentionally to be more of a flag to us of which projects are more important. That's something that we've heard already. The release of the instructions in July, which I would partially put that on me because I was trying to get as much stakeholder input as possible for a return in September. It could seem a little rushed right now by institutions, so we'll see how institutions respond to it. Patty Miller, Paul Marshall, Brenda Smith, the architects behind me, if they could, they would release the instructions for 26, 27, 2 years from now, 6 months ago, to give institutions more time to fill it out. Then third, again, it's will this be followed by the government, the administration and General Assembly? I think that's a concern the presidents have. And that depends on where we are with the economy and what the needs of the state are at the same time.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I guess as we've all talked about too, you know, the law now requires that we produce a list, you know, basically a ranking, and we're going to have to take a long look at that and, you know, how we approach that in this upcoming legislative session as well as any potential change to that. So that's another little footnote to make to this. All right, thank you very much, Commissioner Stafford, for those good remarks, and Dr. Gentile for yours. All right, that's the end of our regular agenda. Do we have any other business to come before the committee at this point? Seeing none, then without objection, the committee will stand adjourned. Thank you for your service to THEC and to the state of Tennessee.